The Twilight of Democracy, a book review. It seems then that we must next consider democracy, how it comes into being, and what character it has when it does, so that, knowing in turn the character of a man who resembles it, we can present him for judgment. Plato's Republic. There have been plentiful books released recently on questions surrounding illiberal democracy, populism, and the causality of these movements. But all of these works have been simply an outsider's perspective. These were works of spectators gazing out into the political landscape, not participants caught up in the motion of its life. We have before us today, however, in the work of The Twilight of Democracy, an attempt to fuse the perspectives of actor and spectator, and thus to give a more nuanced take on the political moment. The 1990s. The book begins at a party that the author is hosting on New Year's Eve to celebrate the opening of the 21st century. The party guests are all some form of cosmopolitan elite or other, politician, writer, academic, etc. Going into the new century, almost all of the party participants consider themselves exuberant proponents of liberal democracy and are excited about the expansion of this ideology all over the globe. Almost all of the members attending the party could be classified as center-right liberals. As the years go by, the party-goers drift apart politically. This drift is meant to signal the changing political currents that are taking place in Western, and some non-Western, democracies all over the globe. What is unique about this book is that it is a story of the elite to the elite. It explains how it is that elites themselves succumb to illiberal tendencies without the socio-economic pressures from immigration or global labor arbitrage, or the general lack of knowledge that is often set to drive non-elites towards the authoritarian or populist path. What drives these elites are the twin Nietzschean attitudes of will to power and resentment, as well as a general ennui brought on by the perceived stasis of liberal democracy, and a politics of nostalgia, nourished in many cases by an authoritarian disposition. The story begins in Poland with the so-called Law and Justice Party. This political party, which held power in the mid-2000s, had shifted rightward in the 2010s. The party began to take on the nationalistic and xenophobic rhetoric of so many far-right parties following the 2008 recession. What is most surprising about all of this is how many elites who would have just a few years prior been supporters of open borders and the free flow of peoples and capital shifted rightward along with the Law and Justice Party itself. From Poland, the book shifts to Central Europe. Hungary. Two examples from the book shows how elites in Hungary became radicalized. First, there is the person of Maria Schmidt, a Hungarian museum curator and historian whom the author has known since 2002 and a political resistor to the Hungarian communists in the 1980s. Schmidt met with the author and during their conversation repeated talking points and conspiracy theories about George Soros owning the Democratic Party and that Hungary was under threat by immigrants despite the fact that immigration rates to the nation are extremely low. Schmidt parroted talking points about transgender issues and such that had no real resonance in Hungarian society, and this just shows how the internet, and in particular the alt-right, can frame one's political perception even in a context in which the conditions for the grievances are not existent. The politics of resentment require no objective referent. Another example of this elite rightward turn can be found in the person of John OSullivan. Now, OSullivan was on the right from the start, speechwriter for Margaret Thatcher and editor of the National Review. OSullivan was now head of a conservative think tank in Hungary. The author went to meet him and expressed bewilderment that during the 80s that he, her, and the current Hungarian head of state, Viktor Orban, were all on the same side. OSullivan responded that it was the author, Applebaum, who had changed, and she was now a part of a, quote, liberal, judicial, bureaucratic, international elite, close quote. England and Spain. The politics of nostalgia can be best observed in England, and to a lesser degree Spain. The old conservatism in England have been in the wilderness for many years after the departure of the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. Even her immediate replacement was seen as a mere functionary, and not the dynamic leader that would remind England of its past greatness. This nostalgia was of a reflective sort. Not the nostalgia that wishes to resurrect the dead, but only to mourn their memory. Not a nostalgia that wishes to restore, but only to recall. The reflective conservatives began to fixate on the European Union as the central symbol of what was lost. Quote, quite apart from any legitimate criticism of EU policies or behaviors. And of course, there were many to be made. Europe became, for some of them, the embodiment of everything else that had gone wrong. The explanation for the toothlessness of the ruling class, the mediocrity of British culture, the ugliness of modern capitalism, and the general lack of national vigor. Close quote. This nostalgia would eventually win the day, and with Brexit, England would leave the EU. In Spain, Santiago Abascal, leader of the Spanish political party Vox, the far-right party that saw the most growth in 2019, has harnessed the politics of nostalgia and elite frustration to great effect. This party aped Trump in one of their commercials and set out a summons to make Spain great again. The party rode the wave of frustration initiated by the Catalan secession movement and the debate about the political legacy of Francisco Franco. Catalonia, a province in Spain, voted for independence from the rest of the nation in 2017, but this vote was annulled by the Spanish Constitutional Court, and chaos spread in the aftermath of the decision. The Make Spain Great Again ad was conjured up by sociologist Rafael Bafraghi, who is an expert in international politics in addition to sociology, and also a Vox Party member. The ad was meant to be a provocation, a gleeful jab at the left. Quote, it was kind of a provocation. It was just intended to make the left a little bit more angry. Close quote. Tired of liberal democracy. Tired being the key word here. The sociologist desires to make alliances with Trump. Of course, there may be other reasons why. The Vox Party member might find it congenial to make alliances with the Trump White House. The will to power may be at work as well. Bafraghi has fallen outside of the establishment after his support for a very unpopular Iraq war, and could possibly see Vox as a path back to power. The United States. Our last stop in this odyssey of the elites is the United States. In 1995, an article in New York Magazine by the late James Atlas entitled "The Counterculture" detailed the goings-on of many of the younger members of the conservative movement. There was David Brooks and David Frum, and Dinesh D'Souza and Bill Kristol, and most importantly for this review, Laura Ingraham. The change in Ingraham from a believer in the optimistic, forward-looking, confident conservatism of Ronald Reagan to a prophetess of doom, lamenting the degeneration of the American fabric, is a concrete representation of the ideological shift in the Republican Party. In 2008, on her radio show, Ingraham still believed in American foreign policy intervention as mostly a force for good, and she also still believed in the overall positive trajectory of American history. Now, Ingraham bemoans demographic change and calls for halts to immigration, speaking of the real America that once existed fading into the darkness. This pessimism and restorative nostalgia is the same force that pushed Trump to electoral victory in 2016. Evaluation. It is difficult to judge a book of this sort because one is unsure what it wants to do. Is it an elegy of liberal democracy or a call for liberal Democrats to beat back the barbarians at the gates? As journalistic look at the lives and attitudes of elites and how they changed with the times, This work is laudable. But as political analysis of our contemporary condition, it shows some blind spots. There are no acknowledgments of the structural problems of the neoliberal and neoconservative order that may have conditioned why many elites are taking on a new position. For example, the recent decline in life expectancy in white Americans based on a highly financialized medical system, the fact that in the contemporary United States, only 46.1% of white Americans over the age of 16 and a mere 40.8% of black Americans now have a full-time job paying more than $20,000 per year. And this is but one of the starkest examples of the extreme economic system of inequality that has arisen as of late. The point that we are making here is this. The author never frames the change in ideology that one of her interlocutors undergoes as possibly rooted in a rethinking of the system of liberal democracy, and really it's the system of neoliberal democracy that some of them are generally against because of its own shortcomings. No, it is always will to power, empty nostalgia, resentment, and schadenfreude. She is not aware that the liberalism that she supports in terms of institutions and economics, for when the adjective liberal is used to modify the term democracy, we're no longer just talking about a system of popular sovereignty and majoritarian rule, but the institutions and mechanisms put in place to safeguard these things is actually undercutting the idea of democracy itself. The institutional apparatus that supports many of the above rights have been given over to unelected technocrats or judges no longer accountable to the vote. Yes, people can still vote, but the power of their vote is diminishing, since many of the institutions and apparatuses that determine policy are no longer directly responsible to voters. What is more, the book itself reads like a work of reflective nostalgia. The author seems to be longing after the lost 90s, a time when high growth and Western global peace masked the facts that wages were still stagnant and civic life was already in precipitous decline, a time when consumerism and the end of the Cold War seemed to provide a reprieve from history. But history, like philosophy, always bears its undertakers. And there is no use in longing after the times of Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, Gerhard Schroeder, or George Herbert Walker Bush. Liberal democracy is undergoing its own examination. What comes of it will prove decisive for geopolitics.